She's just being dramatic. My sister's voice carried through the kitchen wall the way it always had, loud enough to hear, quiet enough to deny. I was standing in the hallway of my father's house in Columbus, Ohio, still in the clothes I'd driven 6 hours in, my coat not even off yet, and already I was being diagnosed. That was the word they used for me in this family. Dramatic. It covered everything. Crying at my mother's funeral when I was 9. Dramatic. Asking questions at the dinner table. Dramatic. Getting into medical school. Showing off, which was just dramatic with better grades. My name is Simone Adler. I'm 36 years old. I'm a hospitalist physician at a teaching hospital in Philadelphia, which means I manage complex inpatient cases, coordinate between specialists, and spend roughly 11 hours a day reading things that other people would rather I didn't look at too closely. My father, Walter Adler, had a heart attack on a Tuesday in October and was dead by Thursday. He was 71. He had been healthy, or so I thought. He walked every morning. He kept his weight down. He called me every Sunday at 7 p.m. and asked about my patients, without asking for details, because he understood privacy, which was more than most people managed. He was the only person in my family who never called me dramatic. I found out he was in the hospital from a text, not from my sister Renee, from a cousin who had seen it on Facebook. By the time I got there, he was already gone. Renee is 4 years older than me and has lived 15 minutes from my father her entire adult life. She married Kevin Marsh when she was 27, Kevin, who coached youth soccer on weekends and made a specific kind of eye contact with women that their husbands were always the last to notice. He worked in real estate development, the kind that involved a lot of optimistic renderings and a lot of delayed timelines. He was handsome in a way he was very aware of, and generous in a way he kept careful track of. Growing up, Renee and I were close, the way two people can be close when one of them is always slightly in charge. She decided what we watched, where we sat, which friends were worth keeping. I didn't fight it because I was younger, and because I had books, and because even then, I understood that some people need to be the most important person in every room, and it costs you very little to let them have it. That changed when I left for college, then medical school, then residency in a different city. To Renee, my absence read as abandonment. To me, it read as survival. To Kevin, I think it read as opportunity. My father's will was read 10 days after the funeral, in the living room of the house where we grew up, by an estate attorney named Phil Greer, who wore bifocals and spoke slowly, and had clearly done this enough times to have developed a careful, neutral face. The house and the bulk of the liquid assets were to be split evenly between Renee and me. There was also a separate provision, a life insurance policy, $400,000, taken out 8 years ago, with both daughters listed as equal beneficiaries. Kevin's jaw did something small and controlled when Phil read that number. I noticed it the way I notice things, quietly, without reacting, filing it away. Renee squeezed my hand after. "We'll figure it all out together," she said. I believed her. I wanted to. 3 weeks later, Phil Greer called me. "I've been contacted by Kevin Marsh on Renee's behalf," he said, his careful voice even more careful than usual. "He's submitted a document he claims your father signed 8 months ago, a beneficiary update form for the life insurance policy. It names Renee as the sole beneficiary." I sat down. "He also submitted a letter," Phil continued, "signed by your father, stating that you had agreed to waive your share in exchange for an early inheritance payment made 2 years ago." "I never received any payment," I said. "I know," Phil said. "That's why I'm calling you. Here's something people don't understand about physicians until they've worked with one on something that isn't medicine. We are trained, above everything else, to read records. Not just to read them, to interrogate them. A medical chart isn't a story, it's a system, and every entry has to be consistent with every other entry. Timestamps must align. Medication orders must match administration records. A progress note written at 3 p.m. cannot reference lab results that weren't resulted until 4 p.m. When things don't line up, it doesn't mean someone made a mistake. It means someone was lying and didn't understand the system well enough to lie correctly. Kevin understood real estate contracts. He did not understand documentation systems. I asked Phil to send me copies of both documents. I sat at my kitchen table in Philadelphia with a cup of coffee and my reading glasses, and I went through them the way I go through a chart on a complicated admission. The beneficiary update form first. It was dated 8 months ago, which would have been February. My father's signature was at the bottom. Walter J. Adler, in the slightly shaky cursive he developed in the last few years as the arthritis in his right hand worsened. I knew that signature. I had seen it on birthday cards and permission slips and the lease for my first apartment when I needed a cosigner and had nowhere else to turn. The signature on the form was too clean. The pressure was too even. My father's handwriting in his last 2 years had a specific tremor pattern, heavier on the downstrokes, lighter on the curves, occasionally a small skip on the letter A, where his pen lifted slightly before he intended it to. I had noticed it because I am a physician, and I notice things about the people I love that I sometimes wish I didn't. The signature on the form had none of that. It was a careful copy made by someone who had practiced from an older document before the tremor developed. But that was something I could see and someone else could argue with. So I went further. My father had been a patient at the same primary care practice in Columbus for 19 years. I called his physician, a Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, and explained who I was and what I needed. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I was wondering if someone was going to call." Under HIPAA, as next of kin, I had the right to request his medical records. I submitted the paperwork that afternoon. The records arrived 4 days later. I went through them in order. My father had been seen in February, the same month as the beneficiary form, for a routine follow-up. The visit notes were thorough. Dr. Okonkwo had documented, clearly and in clinical language, that my father had presented with increasing confusion over the prior 6 weeks, word-finding difficulties, 2 episodes of disorientation at home reported by the patient himself. She had referred him to a neurologist. The neurology intake was 2 weeks later. The preliminary assessment noted moderate cognitive impairment, etiology under investigation, with a recommendation for further imaging. My father had been experiencing documented cognitive decline in February, the same month he supposedly signed a form restructuring his estate. I sat with that for a long time, not as an attorney, not as a strategist, as a daughter who understood now why his phone calls had seemed slightly different in those last months, why he'd sometimes pause in the middle of a sentence and then redirect, why he'd asked me twice in the same conversation about a patient I'd already told him about. I had chalked it up to tiredness, to age. I hadn't looked at it the way I was trained to look at things, because he was my father, and I didn't want to see it. Kevin had looked at it differently. Kevin had seen a window. I called Phil Greer and asked him a single question. What was the standard of mental capacity required to execute a valid beneficiary change under Ohio law? He told me. The signer must understand the nature of the document, the assets involved, and the people affected. I told him what the medical records showed. long pause. "If this is documented," he said slowly, "a form executed during that window would be challengeable on the grounds of lack of capacity." "It's documented," I said, "by his physician, in the clinical notes, time-stamped, co-signed, and entered into the electronic record system before my father died, before any of this became a dispute. Nobody altered those records because nobody knew I would look at them." Another pause. "Simone," Phil said, "I need to ask you something. The letter, the one claiming you received an early inheritance payment, do you have any financial records from 2 years ago? Bank statements, anything showing no such transfer occurred?" "I have everything," I said. "I'm a single woman living in Philadelphia on a physician's salary. I know exactly what has entered my bank account for the last 10 years. There is no transfer. There was never a transfer." Phil was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think we should involve the insurance company's fraud division." I drove back to Columbus on a Friday in December. The meeting was at Phil's office, a glass-fronted suite on the 4th floor of a building downtown, the kind of place designed to make people feel that the details had been handled. Phil sat at the head of the table. To his left was a woman named Andrea Cole from the insurance company's Special Investigations Unit, a former state prosecutor with the specific stillness of someone who has heard every version of every story and is no longer surprised by any of them. Renee and Kevin arrived together. Renee was in a gray wrap dress. Kevin had on a blazer and confidence, the way he always did, like a man who had walked into 100 rooms and been believed in all of them. They didn't look at me directly. I was seated in the corner, a portfolio on the table in front of me. To them, I was the difficult sister, the one who had to be managed. Phil explained that the insurance company had flagged the beneficiary change for review, and that the meeting was to give Kevin and Renee an opportunity to provide supporting documentation. Kevin opened a folder. He slid copies of the beneficiary form and the letter across the table with the smooth efficiency of a man who had done his homework. "Walter was very clear about his wishes," Kevin said. His voice was warm, reasonable, the voice of a man being patient with an unfortunate situation. "Simone received a significant sum 2 years ago when he helped her refinance. This was his way of balancing things out. He discussed it with us extensively." Andrea Cole looked at the documents. She said nothing. Phil looked at me. I opened my portfolio. "I'd like to walk through a few things," I said. Kevin's expression did something small, recalibrating. "This is the beneficiary form," I said, sliding a copy to Andrea. "Dated February 14th. My father's signature is at the bottom." I placed a second document beside it, a card my father had sent me in January of the same year. "This is my father's handwriting from 6 weeks earlier. You can see the tremor pattern in the letter forms, the heavier downstrokes, the slight lift before the capital A." I placed a third document beside it. "The signature on the beneficiary form doesn't have that pattern. The pressure is uniform. There is no lift. This is a copy made from an older sample, before the tremor developed." Renee's chin came up slightly. "I'm not a handwriting expert," I continued, "so let's set that aside. Let's talk about what I am." I slid the medical record summary across the table. "I'm a physician, and these are my father's clinical notes from February 12th, 2 days before this form was signed. His primary care physician documented increasing confusion, word-finding difficulties, and 2 episodes of disorientation. She referred him to a neurologist. The neurology intake, 12 days later, noted moderate cognitive impairment." The room was very quiet. "Under Ohio law," I said, "a beneficiary designation requires testamentary capacity. The signer must understand what they're signing, what assets are involved, and who is affected. These records established that my father was experiencing documented cognitive decline at the time this form was allegedly executed. I looked at Andrea. These records were entered into the electronic medical system before my father died. They were not created for this dispute. They have audit trails, timestamps, and a co-signing physician. They cannot be altered retroactively without triggering a compliance flag that would be visible to the hospital's records department. I turned to the letter, the one claiming I had received an early inheritance. This letter states I received a payment 2 years ago. I have my complete bank records for that period. I set them on the table. There is no such transfer, not from my father's accounts, not from any account connected to this family. The payment Kevin described does not exist in any financial record because it never happened. Kevin leaned forward. Walter managed a lot of things in cash. He was old-fashioned. He was a retired accountant, I said. He did not manage $200,000 in cash. He managed it in documented transfers with paper trails, the same way he managed everything else in his life. There is no record because there was nothing to record. Andrea Cole set down her pen. She looked at Kevin with the expression of someone closing a file. Mr. Marsh, she said, the company will be conducting a full fraud investigation into this claim. I'd recommend you contact an attorney before our next conversation. Kevin's face went through several things in quick succession. Renee was staring at the table. Phil spoke. Given the medical documentation and the absence of any financial evidence supporting the letter's claims, I'll be filing to have the February beneficiary form invalidated on grounds of incapacity. The original designation, equal split, will stand pending the investigation's outcome. Kevin stood up. His chair was loud on the floor. This is a family matter. You're turning it into... Kevin. Renee's voice was very quiet. He stopped. She didn't look at him. She looked at me, and for a moment she looked exactly like she had when we were children, sharing a room and the lights were off, and the performance of the day was finally over. She looked tired. She looked like someone who knew. I didn't know about Dad's diagnosis, she said. Her voice was steady but thin at the edges. I want you to know that. I looked at my sister for a long time. I thought about Sunday phone calls and 6-hour drives and a text from a cousin on Facebook. I know, I said. And I did know. It didn't fix anything, but I knew. The investigation took 4 months. The insurance company's forensic document examiner confirmed what I had seen in the signature. The form had been executed from a copied template using an older signature sample. Kevin was referred to the county prosecutor's office. He was charged with fraud, forgery, and elder financial exploitation. He pleaded guilty to 2 of the 3 counts and received 18 months of probation, a fine, and a civil judgment requiring restitution to the estate. Renee filed for divorce 3 weeks after the charges were filed. I don't know if that was grief or strategy or something she had been building toward for longer than any of this. I didn't ask. Some questions aren't mine to ask. The insurance policy paid out equally, the way my father intended. I used my share to set up a small fund at his church, the one he attended every Sunday for 30 years, designated for elderly parishioners who needed help with medical expenses and didn't know how to ask. I thought he would have liked that. I went back to Philadelphia. I went back to my charts and my rounds and my 11-hour days and my 7 p.m. phone calls that nobody answers anymore. My first week back, I admitted a 74-year-old man whose family had brought him in for confusion and disorientation. The emergency department had noted his age and the presenting symptoms and written likely dementia at the top of the triage note. I read the chart the way I read everything, completely, carefully, from the beginning. I ordered a full workup. sat with him while we waited for results. It was a medication interaction, entirely reversible. He went home 4 days later, carrying on a conversation about his granddaughter's soccer team without missing a single word. His daughter hugged me in the hallway. She said, "Nobody else looked that closely." I didn't tell her that someone had taught me to always look closely. That meticulous men raise meticulous daughters if you let them. That the records don't lie if you know how to read them. And if you love someone enough to read them all the way to the end. I just said, it was in the chart. Because it was. It always is.